September 12, 1945. 11:10 in the morning. Singapore. 7 Japanese generals are walking up the steps of the Municipal building on St. Andrew's Road. They are walking in a line. They are wearing full-dress uniform. Their boots are polished. Their swords are at their sides. Outside the building, 4 guards of honour are drawn up in formation. Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, Indian Army, and Australian paratroopers. A fleet band is playing Rule Britannia. The Royal Artillery has just fired a 17-gun salute that echoed across the harbour and rolled out over the water where 3.5 years earlier the last British warships had sailed away and left this city to its fate. The crowd that has gathered along the street is not silent. They are jeering. They are whistling. They are hooting. These are the people of Singapore, the people who have lived under Japanese occupation for 3.5 years, who have been beaten in the streets for failing to bow to Japanese sentries, who have watched their neighbours dragged from their homes and shot on the beaches, who have buried their dead in unmarked graves and eaten starvation rations and learned to live in a city where the very name of the place they lived had been taken from them and replaced with a Japanese one. They are watching the men who did this to them walk to surrender. A young law student standing in the crowd that morning will remember the scene for the rest of his life. His name is Lee Kuan Yew. He is 21 years old, just days short of his 22nd birthday. He will later become the first Prime Minister of Singapore and one of the most consequential political leaders of the 20th century. In his memoir, The Singapore Story, he will write that the 7 generals walked with faces that were impassive and dignified, looking straight ahead as if the crowd did not exist. He will describe them arriving from High Street at roughly 10:30 in the morning, accompanied by British military police. But here is what Lee Kuan Yew could not see from where he was standing. He could not see what was behind those faces. He could not know that 3 weeks earlier, the senior general in that line, a man named Seishiro Itagaki, had refused to surrender. He had ordered his 70,000 troops to fight to the death. He had prepared a plan to massacre every Allied prisoner of war on the island rather than let them be liberated. He had done everything in his power to ensure that this moment, this walk up these steps, would never happen. And yet, here he was, walking, in polished boots, to sign a piece of paper that his entire military culture, his entire personal identity, his entire understanding of what it meant to be a Japanese officer, told him was worse than dying. The question this investigation turns on is not a military question. It is not about strategy or logistics or who had more ships in the harbour. The question is this: what happens inside a military culture that was built on the absolute prohibition of surrender when surrender becomes the only option left? What did the Japanese generals actually do in the weeks between the Emperor's broadcast and that walk up those steps? Because what they did, the refusals, the suicides, the attempted massacres, the burning of evidence, and finally the silent walk into a room where their enemies were waiting, is one of the most psychologically extraordinary sequences in the entire history of the Second World War. And it began not in 1945, but in a catastrophe that happened in the same city 3.5 years earlier. A catastrophe that the men in that room on September 12 had come specifically to reverse. I should say something now that will sound like a paradox. The Japanese military's greatest weapon was not a weapon at all. It was a belief. And the belief that made them unconquerable in 1942 is the same belief that made their surrender in 1945 psychologically unsurvivable. The code that conquered Singapore became the code that destroyed the men who conquered it. To understand how, we have to go back to a British general walking in the other direction, carrying a white flag on the worst day in the history of the British Empire. February 15, 1942. The same city. The same island. A different world. Lieutenant General Arthur Ernest Percival, General Officer Commanding Malaya Command, is walking toward the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah. Beside him, Major Cyril Wilde carries the white flag of truce. Behind them, Brigadier Newbigin carries the Union Jack. They have been walking through streets where the sounds of shelling have only just stopped. They are walking to surrender the largest British garrison ever to lay down its arms. 70 days earlier, on December 8, 1941, the Japanese 25th Army under Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita had landed at Kota Baru in northern Malaya and at Singora and Patani in Thailand. It was roughly an hour before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, separated by the international date line. What followed was one of the most audacious military campaigns ever fought. Yamashita had approximately 30 to 35,000 men. Percival had roughly 85,000. By every conventional measure, the defense should have held. It did not hold, and the reason it did not hold is the first part of the answer to our question. Yamashita's men came down the Malayan Peninsula on bicycles. Not as a stunt, but as tactical doctrine. The bicycles moved faster than trucks on jungle paths. They required no fuel. They could be carried across rivers and through mud. When the tires went flat, and they frequently did on the rough roads, the Japanese soldiers rode on the bare metal rims, and the rattling sound of rims on road surfaces convinced some British defending units that tanks were approaching, which triggered retreats from otherwise defensible positions. The psychological effect of the advance was as devastating as the physical one. The speed of the Japanese movement created a sense of inevitability. Every defensive line the British established was outflanked within hours. The Japanese moved through jungle the British had assessed as impassable, a miscalculation that came from years of underestimating what lightly equipped, highly motivated infantry could do in terrain that favoured the attacker who was willing to suffer. They leapfrogged positions by landing troops from small boats behind the British lines, forcing withdrawals that cascaded southward down the peninsula. They travelled light, lived off captured supplies, and moved so fast that the defending forces could never stabilise a front long enough to bring their superior numbers to bear. The campaign revealed a painful truth that the British military establishment would spend years trying to understand. Numbers are only an advantage if you can concentrate them. If the enemy is always somewhere you did not expect him, then your 85,000 men fight in fragments, while his 30,000 fight as a fist. 2 days after the landings, the Royal Navy suffered one of its worst single disasters. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, sent north without adequate air cover to intercept the Japanese transports, were caught by Japanese torpedo bombers off the east coast of Malaya on December 10. Both capital ships were sunk in under 2 hours. 840 men died. Churchill, who had personally pushed for the ships to be sent east as a deterrent, was in bed when the telephone rang with the news. He later wrote that in the entire war he never received a more direct shock. The myth of British naval supremacy in the Far East sank with those 2 ships. By the end of January 1942, the British had been pushed off the mainland entirely, back onto Singapore Island. On February 8, the first Japanese troops crossed the Strait of Johor in small boats and landing craft, and established a beachhead on the island's northwestern coast. The fighting lasted 1 week. By February 15, the Japanese controlled the reservoirs that supplied the city's water. Singapore had roughly 24 hours of water left. Percival met with his 12 senior commanders at the Underground Command Centre at Fort Canning, the reinforced bunker. The soldiers called the battle box. The decision was taken to surrender. That evening, Percival walked into the Ford Motor Factory. Yamashita was waiting. The exchange that followed has become one of the most studied moments of the war. Percival tried to negotiate conditions. He wanted to keep 1,000 armed men to maintain order in the city. Yamashita, who was privately desperate because his forces were running critically low on ammunition, and he feared the British would discover how badly outnumbered his army actually was, cut through the discussion. Through his interpreter, Colonel Ichiji Sugita, Yamashita demanded a simple answer. Yes or no. Unconditional surrender, or continued fighting. There is a famous story that Yamashita banged his fist on the table during this exchange. It has been repeated in documentaries and books for decades, but Yamashita himself and his interpreter Sugita both denied it after the war, and by the 1990s the story had been substantially debunked by historians. The yes or no demand, however, was real, and Yamashita later admitted that his entire attack on Singapore had been, in his words, a bluff that worked. Percival said yes. The agreement was reached at approximately 6:10 that evening, and the ceasefire came into effect at 8:30. Approximately 80,000 Commonwealth troops became prisoners of war. 16,000 British, 14,000 Australian, 32,000 Indian. Combined with the roughly 30,000 already captured during the Malayan campaign, the total approached 130,000. Winston Churchill, when the news reached London, called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Months later, his personal physician, Lord Moran, recorded that Churchill, sitting in his bath, said quietly, with something that was neither anger nor grief, but closer to bewilderment, "I cannot get over Singapore." He was not the only one. The fall of Singapore shattered something that was more fragile than anyone had understood. It shattered the idea, held across Asia for more than a century, that the European empires were militarily invincible. A relatively small Japanese force had conquered a garrison that outnumbered it by more than 2-1. The populations of Malaya, Burma, India, and the Dutch East Indies watched it happen. The myth of white military supremacy, the invisible foundation on which colonial authority rested, cracked on that island and would never be repaired. The British Empire would win the war. It would not survive it. And Singapore was the reason. But before we follow what happened to the men who surrendered that day, and before we follow the long road that would bring the British back to this same city 3.5 years later, there is something you need to understand about the men who accepted that surrender. Because the Japanese army that conquered Singapore was not merely a well-trained fighting force, it was the product of a belief system that had no equivalent in any Western military. A belief system that would make the events of August and September 1945, when those same Japanese generals faced their own surrender, unlike anything the world had seen. The code had a name. In the West, it is usually called Bushido, the way of the warrior. But the version of Bushido that shaped the Japanese military of the Second World War was not the gentle philosophical tradition of the ancient samurai. It was a modern radicalized interpretation that had been deliberately constructed by the Japanese state in the decades leading up to the conflict. The key document was issued in January 1941, 10 months before Pearl Harbor. It was called the Senjin Kun, the Instructions for the Battlefield, and it was distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army. Its central instruction was unambiguous. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Do not die in such a way as to leave a bad name. The meaning was absolute. Surrender was not merely discouraged, it was prohibited. A Japanese soldier who allowed himself to be captured had not simply failed a test of courage. He had ceased to exist as a human being in the eyes of his comrades, his commanding officers, his family, and his nation. His name would be struck from the village register. His family would bear the shame. His parents would lower their heads in the street. He would be considered socially dead, even if he was physically alive. This was not cultural pressure alone, it was enforced military law. And it produced a fighting force of extraordinary ferocity. Japanese soldiers fought to the death in numbers that stunned every enemy they faced. On island after island across the Pacific, the pattern repeated. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Peleliu. The Americans would land, the Japanese would resist from fortified positions, and the garrison would fight until it was effectively annihilated. Surrender was so rare that American intelligence officers initially treated Japanese prisoners as curiosities to be studied rather than routine sources of tactical information. At Saipan in June and July of 1944, rather than surrender, thousands of Japanese soldiers launched a final Gyokusai charge into American lines. Hundreds of Japanese civilians on the island, including women and children, threw themselves off the cliffs at the northern tip of the island rather than fall into enemy hands. The scale of self-destruction was almost incomprehensible to Western observers. At Okinawa, one of the last major battles of the Pacific War, roughly 7,400 Japanese troops out of the entire garrison surrendered. That represented approximately 7%. The rest, more than 100,000 men, died fighting or killed themselves rather than be taken alive. Across the entire war, the total number of Japanese military personnel who surrendered before the final capitulation was, by most estimates, somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 out of millions who served. No army in modern history had produced a ratio like it. There was a word for what the code demanded in its most extreme form: Gyokusai. It translates roughly as shattering like a jewel, a poetic way of describing honourable death in battle, or by one's own hand rather than the disgrace of capture. It was not an abstraction, it was operational doctrine. Entire garrisons were ordered to carry out Gyokusai charges, human wave attacks against overwhelming force with the explicit intention of dying. The concept presumed that a death which served the emperor was not a waste. It was the highest achievement a soldier could aspire to. Now hold that thought. Hold it carefully. Because this code, the code that made the Japanese army seemingly unstoppable in the first year of the war, is the same code that would tear its commanders apart in August 1945. The weapon the Japanese military built to break other armies was about to break the men who carried it. And the place where the breaking became visible, the place where the code met reality and reality won, was the same city where the code had triumphed 3.5 years before. What happened to the 80,000 men who surrendered at Singapore is a necessary part of this story, because it is the direct reason the British came back with such deliberate, calculated intent to reverse every detail of the 1942 humiliation. Even before the prisoners reached the camps, the killing had started. On February 14, the day before the formal surrender, Japanese troops of the 18th Division entered the Alexandra Hospital in the southern part of the island. The hospital was clearly marked with Red Cross flags. It was full of wounded men and medical staff. The Japanese soldiers bayoneted patients in their beds. They killed an anaesthetist in the middle of an operation, bayoneting him where he stood. They rounded up roughly 200 staff and patients. Many of them wounded and unable to walk, bound them, and marched them to a series of outbuildings where most were killed the following day. The Alexandra Hospital massacre was not an act of spontaneous battlefield violence. It was sustained and deliberate. The surviving prisoners of the wider garrison were marched to Changi on the eastern tip of the island, where a camp was established in the old British barracks and the adjacent civilian prison. At its peak, Changi and its satellite camps held tens of thousands of men. Conditions deteriorated steadily as the war progressed and as Japanese supply lines came under increasing pressure from Allied submarines. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Rice, when it came, was often rotten or infested. Medical supplies all but disappeared. Diseases that would have been preventable with basic medicine, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, pellagra, tropical ulcers, became killers. Men who had been strong and fit when they entered the camp became skeletal within months. Thousands were shipped out to work on the Burma to Thailand Railway, a project the Japanese military considered vital for supplying their forces in Burma. The prisoners in the world would come to call it the Death Railway. Of roughly 60,000 Allied prisoners of war who were forced to labour on it, approximately 12,500 died from disease, malnutrition, beatings, and exhaustion. Alongside them, An estimated 75,000 or more Asian labourers perished in conditions that were, if anything, worse. The men who survived carried the experience in their bodies and their minds for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of it, many could not. The treatment of prisoners was not accidental or the result of inadequate resources, it was the direct and logical product of the code. Because Japanese military culture considered surrender to be the ultimate dishonour, the men who had surrendered were, in Japanese eyes, beneath contempt. They had forfeited their status as soldiers and as human beings. They could be used as labour, they could be beaten, they could be starved. The code did not merely permit this, it made it rational. If a man who surrenders has ceased to be a man, then nothing done to him requires justification. In Singapore itself, the occupation brought horrors that had nothing to do with prisoners of war. The island was renamed Sayonantu, meaning Light of the South. Japanese time was imposed, moving clocks 90 minutes ahead to match Tokyo. Every person walking past a Japanese sentry was required to bow. Failure to bow could result in a beating or worse. The currency was replaced with Japanese occupation scrip, paper money backed by nothing, which the population came to call banana money. Because of the banana tree printed on the notes, hyperinflation destroyed whatever savings people had. By the war's end, the price of rice had risen from roughly $5 per 100 katis to $5,000. People ate tapioca, sweet potatoes, anything they could grow in the small plots they cultivated in parks and open ground. The city that had been one of the great trading ports of the empire became a place where survival was a daily calculation. Within 3 days of the surrender, the Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, began a systematic operation called Sukching, which translates roughly as purge through cleansing. Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50 were ordered to report to screening centres across the island. Those deemed anti-Japanese, a category that could mean anything from having donated to the Chinese war effort to simply wearing spectacles, which the Japanese associated with education and therefore potential resistance, were loaded onto trucks, driven to the coast and machine-gunned. The operation ran from February 18 to approximately March 4, 1942, and was overseen by a chain of command that included Yamashita, who gave the initial order, Major General Saburo Kamura, who commanded the Singapore garrison, and Lieutenant Colonel Masayuki Oishi, who ran the Kempeitai screening. The death toll is one of the most contested figures of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese official figure after the war was approximately 6,000. Lee Kuan Yew, who lived through the occupation, estimated roughly 70,000 across Singapore and Malaya combined. Historians have generally placed the figure for Singapore itself somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000, with perhaps an additional 20,000 on the Malayan Peninsula. One Japanese staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hishikari Takafumi, later claimed that the original plan had been to kill 50,000 and that roughly half that number had been reached before the order came to stop. The precise total will probably never be known. What is known is that the killing was systematic, it was ordered from the top, and it continued for weeks. The men who ordered these things operated with the certainty of conquerors. They did not imagine, in February 1942, that they would ever have to answer for what they were doing. They did not imagine that the flag they had taken down would ever go back up. They were wrong. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the stories of the men who endured those years visible a little longer, and that matters. The road back to Singapore was not a single road. It was fought across 1,000 miles of jungle, mountain, and river by men who, for most of the war, believed their own country had forgotten about them. The British 14th Army was called the Forgotten Army. The name was not affectionate. It was bitter. The men of the 14th, the largest Commonwealth army ever assembled, roughly 1 million soldiers by the war's end, most of them from the Indian Army, fought in Burma in conditions that made the Western Front look hospitable. Malaria killed more men than the Japanese did in some months. The monsoon turned every road into a river and every track into a swamp. Jungles so thick a man could not see 30 feet in any direction. Supply lines that ran over mountains on the backs of mules. Leeches, snakes, temperatures that could shift from blistering heat to freezing mountain cold in the space of a single day's march. For 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, while the world watched North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then Normandy, nobody in Britain was watching Burma. The troops knew it. They read the newspapers from home when they could get them and found no mention of themselves. They resented it. And they fought anyway. There was another dimension to the Burma campaign that added a layer of bitterness the European theatre never had. After the fall of Singapore, approximately 40,000 Indian prisoners of war had been recruited into the Indian National Army, a force organised first by Captain Mohan Singh and then, after its revival, led by Subhas Chandra Bose, the Indian nationalist leader who had allied himself with Japan and Germany. Bose arrived in Singapore in July 1943 and formed the Provisional Government of Free India that October. The Indian National Army fought alongside the Japanese in the 1944 offensive against Imphal and Kohima. For the Indian soldiers of the 14th Army, this meant that the men trying to kill them sometimes spoke the same language and had in some cases served in the same units before the war. The complexity of that is difficult to overstate. Bose died in a plane crash on August 18, 1945, 3 days after the Emperor's broadcast. The man who turned the forgotten army into the force that would inflict on the Japanese the worst land defeat in their military history was Lieutenant General William Slim. He was not glamorous, he was not aristocratic. He was the son of a Birmingham wholesale ironmonger who had been commissioned during the First World War through a route that had nothing to do with the officer class he was joining. He had been wounded at Gallipoli. He was quiet, methodical, and completely without vanity. His troops, who adored him in a way that soldiers rarely adore generals, described him with a single word that says everything. They called him fair. He treated Indian soldiers with the same respect he gave British soldiers, which in the racial hierarchy of the 1940s, British military was quietly revolutionary. He ate the same rations his men ate. He slept on the ground when they slept on the ground. He understood, in a way that many British commanders of his generation did not, that the Indian and Gurkha and African soldiers who made up the majority of his army were not colonial auxiliaries. They were the army. Without them, there was no 14th Army. There was no campaign. There was no road back to Singapore. In March 1944, the Japanese launched their own offensive into India, the operation known as Yugo, aimed at the cities of Imphal and Kohima in northeast India. It was intended to break through the British defensive line, trigger an Indian uprising against British rule, and link up with the Indian National Army under Subhas Chandra Bose. The campaign became one of the great turning points of the entire Asian War. At Kohima, a garrison that initially numbered roughly 1,500 held against an assault by approximately 15,000 Japanese troops for 2 weeks, in fighting so close that the opposing trenches were separated at one point by the width of a tennis court. That is literally true. The fighting took place across the district commissioner's tennis court, which is today preserved as a memorial bearing one of the most famous inscriptions of the war. When you go home, tell them of us and say, "For your tomorrow we gave our today." The Japanese offensive broke at Imphal and Kohima. It broke because Slim had prepared a defensive plan that deliberately allowed the Japanese to advance and then cut their supply lines behind them. It broke because the monsoon came and turned the Japanese logistics into a catastrophe. And it broke because the men who fought there, Indian, British, Gurkha, held ground that should not have been holdable and then counterattacked when every calculation said they should have been too exhausted to move. The Japanese retreat from Imphal and Kohima cost them approximately 53,000 casualties. Many of those who retreated died not from wounds but from starvation and disease on a road that became known to the Japanese as the White Bone Road, because of the skeletons of soldiers who had dropped and died along it. Slim then pursued. Through late 1944 and into 1945, the 14th Army drove south through Burma. The crossing of the Irrawaddy River in February 1945 was one of the great opposed river crossings of the war, conducted across a front of over 200 miles with the Japanese defending the far bank. Slim used deception, feinting at one crossing point while sending his main force across at another in a maneuver that wrong-footed the Japanese command and opened the road to Mandalay. The 14th Army recaptured Rangoon in May 1945, in a race against the monsoon that came down to days. The Japanese army in Burma was not merely defeated, it was destroyed as a fighting force. The campaign was the longest land campaign fought by British and Commonwealth forces in the entire Second World War, and it inflicted on the Imperial Japanese Army the single worst land defeat in its history. When it was over, when the last Japanese positions in Burma had been overrun, most of the public at home still did not know it had happened. Slim would later be made a field marshal and serve as Governor-General of Australia. The men who served under him never forgot what he had been to them. But the British public, fixated on the war in Europe, gave the 14th Army a reception that was, at best, belated and, at worst, negligent. The name Forgotten Army was earned, but Singapore remained. Singapore was the prize that mattered, not strategically, because by 1945 the city had limited military significance, but psychologically. Singapore was the wound. It was the place where the empire had been publicly humiliated. The men who planned the reconquest, and particularly the man who would command it, understood that the manner of taking it back mattered as much as the taking itself. The plan was called Operation Zipper. It was the largest amphibious assault plan for the Indian Ocean, a landing on the coast of Malaya near Port Swettenham and Port Dickson, scheduled for September 9, 1945. More than 100,000 Allied troops would go ashore, supported by over 500 aircraft and a substantial naval force. The follow-up operation, codenamed Mail Fist, would drive south towards Singapore, with the liberation of the city expected sometime between December 1945 and March 1946. The man commanding the entire theatre was Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. Mountbatten was everything. Slim was not. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a second cousin of King George VI, handsome, charming, politically connected, and possessed of an instinct for theatre that would prove in the end more consequential than any of his military decisions. Because Mountbatten understood something that not every general grasps. He understood that the reconquest of Singapore was not primarily a military problem. It was a symbolic one. It was the reversal of a humiliation, and the reversal had to be staged with the same care and precision as a coronation. Then in August 1945, the world changed. On August 6, an American B-29, named the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 8 and 9, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops. The Japanese military, which had spent months preparing to defend the home islands to the last man, was suddenly confronting destruction from multiple directions at once. On August 15, 1945, something happened that had never happened before in the history of Japan. The emperor spoke directly to his people. The broadcast, known as the dual voice broadcast, was recorded on a phonograph disc and played at noon Tokyo time. It was the first time any Japanese emperor had addressed the common people. His voice, speaking in formal classical court, Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand, announced that Japan had decided to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. He never used the word surrender. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. He said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The night before the broadcast, a group of young army officers had stormed the imperial palace in a coup attempt, searching the building room by room to find and destroy the recording before it could be aired. They failed. The recording was smuggled out. The broadcast went out on schedule. Across Japan, people wept in the streets. Many had never heard the emperor's voice. Some did not understand what he was saying, but everyone understood what it meant. And here is where the question at the heart of this investigation comes into focus. Because for the Japanese military commanders scattered across Southeast Asia, the emperor's broadcast did not end the war. It started a crisis that was, in some ways, more devastating than any battle they had faced. The crisis was this: the code, the Senjin-kun, the entire cultural architecture of the Japanese military rested on two pillars. The first pillar was the absolute prohibition of surrender. The second pillar was absolute obedience to the emperor. For the entire war, these two pillars had pointed in the same direction. The emperor willed the war. The soldier fought the war. The soldier did not surrender because the emperor had not told him to. The soldier chose death over capture because the emperor's honor required it. The system was internally consistent. It worked. Now, on August 15, the two pillars pointed in opposite directions. The emperor had told his soldiers to stop fighting, but stopping meant surrendering, and surrender was the one thing the code absolutely forbade. Japanese general in August 1945 was caught between two commands, both of which were absolute, both of which were sacred, and both of which contradicted each other. What he did next would depend on which command he chose to obey, and the answer was not the same for every general. Across the Japanese Empire, the broadcast produced reactions that ranged from immediate compliance to outright rebellion. In some garrisons, commanders ordered their men to lay down arms within hours. In others, officers tore up the surrender orders and told their troops to prepare for a final battle. On the island of Hokkaido, Japanese units continued fighting Soviet forces for days after the broadcast. In the Philippines, scattered units refused to believe the broadcast was genuine. In Manchuria, the collapse was chaotic, with entire formations dissolving as the Soviet offensive rolled over them. The response depended on the individual commander, his temperament, his relationship with his superiors, and the depth of his commitment to the code that said death was preferable to shame. In Singapore, the man who had to choose was General Seishiro Itagaki, commander of the Japanese 7th Area Army, responsible for forces across Malaya, Singapore, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Itagaki was not a minor figure in the war. He had been one of the principal conspirators behind the Mukden incident of 1931, the staged explosion on a railway line that Japan used as a pretext to invade Manchuria. He had served as Minister of War in 1938 and 1939. He was, by temperament and conviction, a hardliner of the most extreme kind, a man who believed that the Japanese military existed to fight and that surrender was an impossibility that need not be discussed. When the Emperor's broadcast reached Singapore, Itagaki's first response was to reject it, not publicly. He could not publicly defy the Emperor. But operationally, he began preparing for continued resistance. He ordered his troops to maintain their positions. He reinforced defensive works. And according to multiple post-war accounts and testimony at the war crimes trials, he authorized preparations for the execution of all Allied prisoners of war on the island. The men who had survived Changi, who had survived the death railway, who had endured 3.5 years of captivity, were to be killed before the British could reach them. This was not a rogue decision. Across the Japanese Empire, similar plans existed. The Japanese military had contingency orders for the disposal of prisoners in the event of an Allied landing. The men in those camps were, in the calculus of the code, already dead. They had surrendered. They had no status. Their continued existence was a logistical inconvenience that could be resolved with a single order. The resolution came from above. Field Marshal Count Hisaichi Terauchi, the overall commander of the Southern Army and Itagaki's superior, had suffered a stroke but retained enough authority to act. On or around August 18, Itagaki travelled to Saigon to meet Terauchi. He expressed his unwillingness to surrender. Terauchi ordered him to obey the Emperor's command. On August 19, a British signals officer, Captain Oceanoan, parachuted into the Bukit Timah Turf Club to determine Japanese intentions and make contact with the occupation command. On August 20, Itagaki signalled Mountbatten's headquarters that he would comply with the Emperor's decision. But compliance is not the same thing as acceptance. And what happened in Singapore between the Emperor's broadcast and the formal surrender ceremony is the answer to the question in our title. It is what the Japanese generals actually did. Some chose the path the code demanded. They chose death. The most widely reported account describes a gathering at Raffles Hotel on the night of August 22, after Itagaki had informed his senior staff that the decision to surrender was final. According to this account, several hundred Japanese officers and soldiers held a farewell sake party in the hotel and then took their own lives. The number most commonly cited is roughly 300. This figure should be treated with caution. Roberto Pregales, a former manager of Raffles Hotel, said he had never heard the story and doubted it. Ilse Sharp, the hotel's first biographer, described the claim as an extreme exaggeration, though she allowed that a smaller number of suicides probably did occur. A separate report describes an entire platoon killing themselves with grenades at another location. What is certain is that some Japanese military personnel in Singapore chose death over the humiliation of surrender, and that their choice was entirely consistent with the code they had been raised in. They had been taught that surrender was worse than death. Some of them proved it with their lives, thus chose a different path entirely. Roughly 200 Japanese soldiers left their units and attempted to join the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the communist guerrilla force that had been fighting the occupation throughout the war. Most returned to Japanese lines within weeks. And then there was the evidence. In the days after the Emperor's broadcast, Japanese military personnel across Singapore engaged in a systematic destruction of documents. Files were burned. Records were dismantled. Administrative archives covering 3.5 years of occupation, the paper trail of Suk Ching, the prisoner of war camps, the forced labour programs, the Kempeitai operations, all of it fed into fires that burned across the island. Itagaki himself delayed informing some of his subordinate units about the surrender for several days. Historians have noted that one likely purpose of this delay was to buy time for the destruction of evidence. This is what the Japanese generals did. They refused, they died, they burned the evidence. They planned massacres that were stopped only by a direct order from a field marshal who had to overrule his own subordinate to prevent them. And then, when none of those options had changed the fundamental reality that the Emperor had spoken, they surrendered. But the surrender itself was not a simple signing of papers. It was a performance, and the man who directed the performance understood exactly what he was doing. On September 2, 1945, the same day the formal Japanese surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, British forces began Operation Tiger Race, the naval reoccupation of Singapore. The task force that sailed from Trincomalee and Rangoon numbered roughly 100 vessels, including the French battleship Richelieu with the heavy cruiser HMS Sussex serving as flagship. Mountbatten had ordered the fleet to approach without offensive armament displayed, a calculated gamble on his assessment that the Japanese would not resist. He was right, the gamble was not reckless. Mountbatten had been receiving signals through intermediaries and intelligence channels indicating that the Japanese garrison would comply. But the possibility of resistance from rogue elements, from officers who had chosen the code over the Emperor, could not be entirely eliminated. 2 days before the fleet reached Singapore, British forces had already accepted the surrender of Penang in Operation Jurist on September 2. The signal was clear. The Japanese in Southeast Asia were complying, unit by unit, port by port. The fleet reached Singapore on September 4. That same morning, Itagaki and Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudoma boarded HMS Sussex in Keppel Harbour to receive the preliminary surrender terms. They were met by Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christison and Major General Robert Mansergh. The Japanese officers came aboard in full uniform. They were correct. They were formal. They showed nothing. There is a small detail from that meeting that captures the tone of everything that followed. A Japanese officer reportedly noted that the British delegation was 2 hours late. The British reply was, "We do not keep Tokyo time here." The first troops went ashore on September 5. They were men of the 1st Punjab Regiment, followed by the 5th Indian Division. There was a particular significance in that. The men who liberated Singapore were in large part Indian soldiers serving under the British Crown, the same army that the Indian National Army had tried to persuade to defect, the same army that Bose had told the world would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. It had not collapsed, it had marched from Imphal to Rangoon to Singapore, and now it was walking ashore. One of their first objectives was Changi. The camp where tens of thousands had suffered for more than 3 years was liberated that day. The prisoners who emerged were, in many cases, barely recognizable as the men who had walked in. They were emaciated. Some weighed less than half their normal body weight. Many were suffering from diseases that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They walked out into sunlight and saw the Indian and British soldiers, and some of them wept, and some of them stood still, and some of them simply could not believe it was over. But the moment that Mountbatten had been building toward, the moment designed to close the circle on February 15, 1942, came 1 week later. September 12, 1945. The Municipal building. Every detail of the ceremony was a deliberate inversion of the surrender at the Ford Motor Factory. 1942, a British general had walked to surrender carrying a white flag. In 1945, 7 Japanese generals walked to surrender while a fleet band played Rule Britannia. In 1942, Yamashita had demanded yes or no. In 1945, Mountbatten ensured that the proceedings made one thing explicit. The Straits Times headline the next morning said it plainly. This is no negotiated surrender. In 1942, the surrender had taken place in a factory, a cramped, functional space chosen by the conqueror. For convenience, in 1945, the ceremony was held in the grandest civic building in Singapore, with guards of honour and salutes and the ceremonial trappings of a state occasion. 1942, it had been swift and businesslike. In 1945, it was drawn out, measured, designed to be watched and photographed and reported and remembered. Mountbatten understood that the audience for this ceremony was not the 400 people in the room. It was the millions across Asia who had watched the British Empire fall in 1942 and who needed to see its flag go back up in 1945. Itagaki signed 11 copies of the Instrument of Surrender on behalf of Field Marshal Terauchi, who had suffered a stroke and could not attend. The Japanese delegation comprised 7 senior officers, including Lieutenant General Hayataro Kimura of the Burma Area Army, Vice Admiral Fukudome, and Lieutenant General Numata, Terauchi's Chief of Staff. Mountbatten accepted on behalf of all Allied forces. Across the whole of the Southeast Asia Command, approximately 500,000 Japanese military personnel were laying down their arms. Mountbatten read an order of the day on the steps of the building afterward, and led 3 cheers for the king. Roughly 400 spectators attended, including the Sultan of Johor and liberated prisoners of war. Mountbatten wrote in his diary that night, held today by the University of Southampton Special Collections, to receive the unconditional surrender of 500,000 enemy soldiers, sailors, and airmen must be an event which happens to few people in the world. I was very conscious that this was the greatest day of my life. And then came the flag. During the occupation, a Malayan civil servant named Mervyn Cecil Frank Shepherd had hidden a Union Jack inside his pillow at Changi Prison. For 3.5 years, through the beatings, the disease, the starvation rations, and the daily uncertainty of whether he would survive to see another morning, Shepherd kept that flag hidden. He was not the only one. Major Cyril Wilde, who had carried the white flag during Percival's surrender march to the Ford Motor Factory in 1942 and served as the British interpreter at the meeting with Yamashita, had separately preserved the Union Jack the Brigadier Newbigging had carried that day. Wilde told the Japanese the flag had been burned. It had not. On September 12, 1945, the flag that had been hidden in a pillow in Changi was raised over Singapore to the national anthem. The same flag. The same city. Different hands pulling the rope. 3.5 years of suffering folded into a single piece of cloth being pulled toward the sky. If your father or grandfather or great-grandfather served in the Far East, in Malaya, in Burma, in Singapore, in any part of that long war that history has too often called the Forgotten War, I would be honoured to read their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details, the small, personal, specific things, are the actual record of what happened. They deserve to be kept by the people who carry them. There is one more scene in this story, and it happened 10 days before the Singapore ceremony, and it brings the circle to its tightest point. On September 2, 1945, the formal Japanese surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Standing behind him, deliberately positioned in a place of honour, were 2 men. One was American General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines in 1942. The other was Arthur Percival. Percival, the man who had walked to the Ford Motor Factory to surrender, had spent 3.5 years as a prisoner. After Singapore, he was held initially at Changi, and then transferred to a succession of camps, ending at a facility in Manchuria called Xi'an, where he was held alongside other senior Allied officers, including the American General Wainwright. He was liberated in August 1945 by an American Office of Strategic Services team that parachuted into the camp as Japanese authority collapsed around them. When Percival emerged from captivity, he was gaunt and emaciated, aged far beyond his years. He had not expected to survive. MacArthur, who understood the power of symbols as well as any commander of the war, had specifically requested that both Percival and Wainwright be present aboard the Missouri. He positioned them directly behind him at the signing table. When the ceremony was complete, MacArthur gave Percival one of the pens used to sign the instrument of surrender, a gesture that was both personal and deeply calculated. The man who had lost the worst British defeat was present at the final victory. Percival was then flown to the Philippines to witness the surrender of Yamashita the following day, September 3. The man who had demanded yes or no at the Ford Motor Factory 3.5 years earlier was now the one being told the terms. At that ceremony, according to accounts from officers present, Percival refused to shake Yamashita's hand. The man who had surrendered the largest British garrison in history stood in front of the man who had taken that surrender and would not touch him. The aftermath was methodical, and it was final. The men who had conquered Singapore, who had administered it, who had ordered the killings and built the camps and signed the orders that sent men to the death railway, faced the courts. Yamashita was tried by an American military commission in Manila, beginning in October 1945. He was not charged for what had happened in Malaya or Singapore. He was charged for the atrocities committed by Japanese forces in the Philippines, particularly the destruction of Manila, in which troops under Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi had committed mass killings of civilians, largely against Yamashita's own orders. The legal principle established by his trial, that a commanding officer bears responsibility for the actions of troops under his authority, regardless of whether he ordered those actions, became known as the Yamashita Standard. It remains a foundational concept in international law to this day. He was sentenced to death on December 7, 1945, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The United States Supreme Court rejected his appeal 6-2, with Justices Frank Murphy and Wiley Rutledge dissenting in terms that remain among the strongest in the court's history. They argued that Yamashita had been convicted, not for what he did, but for who he was. He was hanged at Los Banos in the Philippines on February 23, 1946. Itagaki was tried by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. He was found guilty on multiple counts, including crimes against peace, conspiracy, and responsibility for inhumane treatment of prisoners of war under his command. The tribunal specifically rejected his defense that Allied submarine attacks on Japanese shipping had excused the horrific conditions in his camps. He was sentenced on November 12, 1948, and hanged at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo on December 23, 1948. The Sukching perpetrators were tried in Singapore in 1947. Major General Kawamura and Lieutenant Colonel Oishi were sentenced to death and hanged on June 26, 1947. Others received life sentences. One name was conspicuously absent from the dock. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer widely considered the principal architect of the massacre, escaped justice entirely. He fled through Southeast Asia, hid in a Buddhist monastery in Thailand, eventually returned to Japan under an assumed identity, and was elected to the Japanese parliament. He disappeared in Laos around 1961 and is presumed dead. He was never tried for what he did in Singapore. So here is the answer to the question this investigation began with. What did the Japanese generals do when Britain took back Singapore in 1945? They did everything the code demanded, except the one thing the code existed for. They refused orders. They planned the execution of helpless prisoners. They burned the evidence of their crimes. Some of them killed themselves rather than face the moment that was coming. They delayed, obstructed, and resisted in every way a military culture built on the absolute prohibition of surrender could resist an order to surrender. And then the emperor spoke, and the code turned on them. Because the code was never in the end a code about fighting, or about courage, or about honor. It was a code about obedience. And when the object of that obedience said, stop, the code said stop. The two pillars that had pointed in the same direction for 4 years of war pointed in opposite directions for 3 weeks in August 1945. The pillar of obedience won, because it had always been the stronger pillar. The prohibition on surrender was sacred. The emperor was more sacred. 7 generals walked up the steps of the municipal building while the crowd jeered. A flag hidden in a pillow for 3.5 years was raised over the city. A fleet band played in the harbour. And somewhere in that crowd, a 21-year-old law student watched and remembered, and would still be writing about it half a century later, because what he saw on those steps that morning was not merely a military ceremony. It was the visible surface of something that had broken inside the men who were walking. They were impassive and dignified, Lee Kuan Yew wrote, looking straight ahead. That is what the code looked like from the outside. From the inside, it was 7 men walking to do the thing their entire lives had taught them was worse than death, because the one voice that outranked death had told them to do it. The men who died in the camps and on the railways and in the unmarked graves of Sukching had names. They came from towns across Britain and India and Australia and Malaya. They had families who waited for letters that stopped coming. Some of them never came home. Some of them came home and never spoke of what had happened. And one of them, a civil servant whose name most people have never heard, hid a piece of cloth inside his pillow and kept it safe through 3.5 years of captivity because he believed that one day someone would come back to raise it. Someone did. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this story reach the viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the history that flatters any nation, and not the history that excuses any army, but the history that actually happened, with the names and the details and the things that were done and the things that were endured. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories, and most of them are about ordinary men who found themselves carrying burdens that generals and emperors had placed on them, and who carried those burdens because there was no one else, and because the someone who had to was always in the end.